So I was just, for those online, I was just giving a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I won't go through it again, but you can see from the overview slide, and hopefully you'll get the sense as I move through the presentation, going through talking about images in general, why we should care about images, then to climate images specifically, and then to talking through 3 particular case studies into more recent work from me and my group. So I was looking online last week. Let's have a look at some climate change news to put on this slide. Here's a kind of classic article from The Guardian, which I know many of you will know, and The Guardian obviously has an Australian outlet as well, and is, you know, by far the biggest source of climate change news, you know, in terms of volume of kind of any news media, newspaper media, certainly. So this, and the image they have here is a real classic for floods. And you might think, oh, look, it's really engaging. There's a woman holding her child, you know, talking about the future of climate change, what her worries are, and so on. And indeed, many of those things stand. But we also know from visual politics work that these kind of visual tropes are really common, not only in climate change communication, but in other types of communication about risk as well. And the idea that the woman is pictured there on her own without supportive others, there are no men in the picture, her house isn't shown, there's no you know, people helping and so on. She's alone in the kind of in the open without home or supportive or securitized others. So there's lots that we can say about how this image kind of fits into a more general narrative around shaping how we respond to risk. So imagery is important because, first of all, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, right? Like if you're online, if you are somebody who tweets, for example, and you want people to get more engagement with your tweets, the first thing Twitter will tell you is put an image with your tweet, because it will, that on average, images with tweets with images get a lot more views. So it doesn't matter what your image is, even, just, you know, images get more views. So that is the first thing, it's everywhere. And particularly with the rise of social media and more visual social media, we're seeing, you know, the role of Instagram and TikTok and all these kind of much more visual media, the role of images is actually super important and really key to how things get shared and so on. We know that images affect news production. So in the TV news studio, for example, if you don't have good images, your story doesn't run. And I'm sure there'll be people in here who've had exciting studies come out and they've talked to the news media, and then their story has kind of got relegated to the back, you know, in the middle of the unread section of the newspaper, or far down the news broadcast, or not made it at all, just because it's actually quite hard to illustrate a lot of the work that we do about climate change and science and so on. And that's because, you know, if you don't have compelling visuals, then the news media are just not interested. So the availability of the imagery is really important as well. And thirdly, images affect news reception, how people engage with the news. The images help to draw viewers in, so that, you know, when you get a big news story, often the news flash, you know, that visual on the front page is really important. And the same online, you know, the thumbnail, we often get really cliche thumbnails because news media organisations know that they are the things that people click on and draw them in, even if they know they're problematic and their actual larger image on the news site is quite different. Images help us to remember information, and they also influence our sharing behaviour, as I've sort of mentioned. So images are really important. And climate imagery specifically is important because it's a key part of setting the frame for climate change engagement. So we know from previous research, including research from our group, that the image actually really helps to set the agenda, tell us what the news article is about, how we should engage with it, what's important, what's missing, and so on, who's responsible. And the climate imagery affects our emotional response to climate change and even our behavioural intentions. So some really early work by Anthony Lazarowicz, I'm sure you all know, at Yale, has shown that the images that we hold in our mind, which are very closely related often to the images out there in our kind of cultural, social world, influence how we might vote, are correlated to how we might vote. And thirdly, despite its key role, imagery and climate imagery is studied far less than text by communications practitioners and by academics. And a lot of that, I suspect, is because it's much trickier to collect images. Anyone who's ever used LexisNexis or, you know, one of those online those organisations to gather text will know you just have to bung in a couple of keywords and it spits you out a whole bunch of text data, newspaper data, or, you know, blogs or whatever you're looking at. But it's really hard to get images. You have to go onto individual news sites, individual websites, and go and try and find the original broadcast to actually collect the images themselves. And within the academy, within universities, the research world, we know that text is privileged, right? So, you know, we don't see visual essays. They're just really quite rare, apart from in some very specific disciplines. So imagery is really kind of maligned often. Yeah, despite the key roles that we know it plays. So what I want to show you here is I try and get people, if you feel brave enough, to make a kind of like sound response to each of these images. So if you see that, how would you feel? Like, oh, maybe. Okay, so go for it. Make a noise. Right. This one. Oh, brilliant. Yeah. Okay. All right. So all of those images are like, you know, just in a kind of really sort of jokey sense, getting you to feel different things and bringing up a whole set of assumptions and ideas about what climate change is, who's important, who's playing a role, who's missing, whose voices are privileged, who holds the power to make a change. So here's some work that this is the work that I started when I was at Melbourne Uni. So it is quite old now. We collected it, or I collected it in 2010. I should say because it is actually a sole author paper, very unusually for my work. And what I did was collect all the newspaper imagery that was attached to stories about climate change from 13 different newspapers in the US, the UK and Australia across a whole year. And then I looked at all the different images and I categorized them. You know, what were they showing? What was their primary denotative, as we call it, content? And as you can see, the majority of images is about people, and the majority of those images were politicians. And that won't surprise anyone who works in news media, because of course a lot of news media is using that kind of political frame about climate change. He said, she said, you know, it's about the people involved, the political arguments. The second most common was climate impacts images, so ice, fires, flooding, so on. And third most common was protest. And note that these are tend to be shots that are distant, you know, got many faces, nobody individualized, shot from a distance and so on. We'll talk about more of that later on. And the images of climate solutions, you know, renewable energy, things you might do in your home and your workplace and so on, to adapt or mitigate the effects of climate change are much more rare. So most climate visuals feature people, primarily politicians. There's a limited visual coverage of protest and a limited visual discourse of protest. They're very similar sorts of images, those distant ones, and few images are showing climate solutions, mitigation or adaptation. So then I took a representative sample of these images, so, you know, 1,500 or so images here, distilled them down into 40 sort of main types, if you like. And I worked with a bunch of colleagues across the US, UK and Australia to see how different, how people interacted with these images. So effectively, if you've ever used a Q sort before, it's a really nice method. You give generally people a bunch of statements, but here we're using images instead. So like 40 postcard size images, and you ask them to sort them very quickly based on their gut feeling. So sort A, this picture makes you feel climate change is important. Agree, disagree, 2 different piles, and in the middle, don't have an opinion. And you sort them really quickly, agree, disagree, don't care, do all of 40. Then you pick up the pile of makes me feel it's important, and you choose the 2 images that make you feel it's most important, and you put them at the far end, and then you choose the next 3 that makes you feel it's important, and so on. And as you can see, if I probably can't get this to the cursor to work, but effectively what you're doing is a normal distribution, right? So for the scientists, the mathematicians, statisticians in the room, and you do the same on the other scale. So there are images that don't make you feel it's important, to most feel it's not important at that end, and all the way down. And the ones in the middle are the ones that you don't have a strong opinion about. And so what you can do is then look at the sort of statistics of this across different people and see how similar or different people's views are. And the great thing about QSOT is not only are you doing this kind of statistical work on their kind of perceptions of visuals, but you also interview them afterwards. Like, what made you feel, you know, why was this one important? Why did you not feel this one was important? Oh, I noticed you've got loads of people in the middle. Tell me about that. So we did all of that for the first sort, and then you take all the images off and effectively do the same thing for the second sort. This picture makes you feel that I can do something about climate change. And if you're a psychologist, you'll quickly realize you've got 2 different sorts there. The first is about saliency, the importance, and the second is about what we call self-efficacy, a sense of being able to do something. So measuring two different things. What we found is the results are remarkably consistent across and within the country cohorts. So people were similar within Australia, UK, US, and similar across between the three different countries as well, which indicated to us that there's a dominant, in these countries anyway, mainstream discourse around climate images, i.e. people think in similar ways in these three countries about climate images. And the findings were that imagery of climate impacts promotes feelings of salience, makes people feel that climate change is important, but it makes them also feel that they can't do anything. Climate impacts makes people feel that that undermines their sense of self-efficacy. Thank you. Secondly, energy futures imagery makes people feel they can do something about climate imagery, about climate change. But remember, there's hardly any pictures of energy futures in the news media that we're seeing. So they might make people feel they can do something, but they're not actually seeing very much of that at the moment anyway. And finally, remember that all those pictures of politicians, well, those images make people feel that climate change is not important. And it also, in most countries, it made them feel that they can't do anything either. So we found in sort of an overarching finding that the climate images either appear to increase people's feeling of being able to do something, their saliency or their self-efficacy, but not able to do both. So there's no image, right, that does everything for climate change, which won't be hopefully a surprise to any of you, because it's often a question I get asked by journalists: what's the best image I should use? There's no such thing as a best image. What are you trying to do with the image? What's the story you're trying to tell? Are people on board already, or are you trying to already kind of bring them along that climate change is important, or are you trying to kind of suggest to them that there's kind of hopeful futures, there's things they can do, and so on? You will need different images to do those different things. Okay, so moving into more kind of recent work then, this is work about all those polar bear, bits of data that I had, all those cartoons and mugs and Christmas cards and all those other things, along with a whole bunch of other images that I found and investigated online. So I plotted them on this figure here. On the top kind of dark grey, it's not so clear on the slide, but there's a kind of top grey band, and they're all the different images that I found. So like there's a Time news article, for example. There's various news media articles that are important in the climate debate. There's the Coca-Cola, the beginning of the Coca-Cola adverts, with the polar bear sipping the Coke in the Arctic. There's the Plain Stupid ad of some of you might remember, I think it was about 2008, 2009, of polar bears falling from the sky in a kind of dramatic fashion. There's a film, it's The Skin You're Living In, by Julie Doyle, who many of you might know is a real prominent expert on climate visuals. And moving into more recent times, images used in climate strikes and so on. The BBC's Climate Bot, illustrated by a picture of a polar bear. And in the bottom, kind of lighter grey, is studies that have looked at polar bear imagery and how people engage with those globally in different countries. So as you can see, there's a change in how polar bears are represented. And I'll briefly talk through this with some examples. So yeah, here's that polar bear hanging out in the Arctic, always cool, always Coca-Cola. And in fact, Coca-Cola have tried to, had a big campaign trying to raise money, trying to make a refuge in the Arctic for polar bears. So because of climate change, so they're already beginning to be this kind of climate icon. There they are in a Time magazine article, polar bears are in danger, and so are you. And an article, polar bears on thin ice. But all of these things are directly related to the polar bear itself, right? The polar bear is important because it's talking about a story of climate impacts. There's less sea ice, therefore there's less areas for polar bears to hunt, to breed, for their habitat. So therefore polar bear populations are in decline. It's a simple story, a really sad story, right? But a simple story illustrating about climate impacts. As we move into the mid to late 2000s, though, the story starts to change. Polar bears become much more politicised. So this starts with things like Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth. Polar bear climbs onto an ice floe, the ice floe breaks. He climbs onto it again, it breaks apart again. He climbs onto a tiny slice, it's far too small to hold his weight, and the camera pans out, and there's the polar bear swimming in this vast ocean devoid of ice. Then there's that picture, Polar Meltdown by Arnie Navarra, which ironically won the Shell Wildlife Photographer of the Year award in 2008. And then the Vanity Fair cover, right, with Leonardo DiCaprio there, pictured, the green issue, Leo DiCaprio, the celebrity of the time, pictured with Canute the polar bear. the famous polar bear from Berlin Zoo, who's brought up by his keeper. So the polar bear becomes much more politicized, becomes embroiled in debates around climate change, comes to start to represent climate change, becomes a climate icon during that time. But as we move into more recent times, that kind of politicization kind of grows and morphs and changes, and the polar bear just has become like this kind of stereotypical, cliched, parodied climate icon. So the polar bear in that left-hand news article, Don't Look Now, by James Delingpole, who's a climate skeptical, contrarian columnist in the UK's Telegraph newspaper, you know, just ridicules the idea that polar bears could be in trouble. You know, the polar bear winks. How ridiculous that I could be, you know, this big charismatic megafauna could be impacted by something as ridiculous as climate change. In the middle, the National Geographic posted this picture and said, this is what climate change looks like. It's their most retweeted, their most viral image that they've ever had, retweeted something crazy like 2 billion times, or, you know, various different social media platforms. And they had a huge backlash to this from climate contrarians and others, saying that, well, how can you pin climate change on this particular bear? He might be nutritionally deficient, you know, he might have a genetic malfunction, blah, blah, blah. You can't say that climate change has caused the decline in this particular bear's condition. Therefore, your statement is wrong. And of course, people don't care about, you know, that particular bear. They don't care about that image, but they really care about what that image represents. The polar bears come to represent climate change. If we can pin climate change on that bear, then that means a whole bunch of other things about how we deal with and think about climate change. So the bear has really become climate change. You don't need explanatory text anymore. And that brings me to the sort of right-hand side of that screen, the BBC's climate bot. There's no image on the BBC. Climate bot is like you stick in, you know, any questions you have about climate change and it answers them, kind of AI tool. There's no other image required. There's no explanatory text. The icon that is needed to talk about climate change is just polar bears. And much of this has been kind of contested and led by the Global Warming Policy Group and Susan Crockford's work that's pictured there about, you know, are polar bear populations declining because of climate change? And really it's all linked to the real power that this visual icon has in the climate debate. So just to summarise then, you know, in the early 1990s, polar bears were only really linked to climate change by scientists. When they were in the media, when they were in public discourse, it was about that very simple link between sea ice decline causing polar bear population decline. And then there's this rapid politicization, and now polar bear images have been established by what I've called a visual metonym. So they come to stand alone, even without text. They don't need any kind of explanation. Audience have a complex knowledge, globally, I would argue, but particularly in Anglophone nations, a complex knowledge to decode these kind of satirical, parody, kind of cliched bear images. You don't need explanatory text to know that a polar bear stands for all these different things now. Okay. Moving on to the second case study then about climate change protest. So like I say, this is drawing on Sylvia's excellent MRes paper that you can see down in the bottom right-hand corner. And it uses some of my data that I mentioned in that first study, the 2010 one, looking at all the different images across time. So Sylvia looked to see where protest images have been used in the newspaper archive, my old data set, and also then in digital newspapers in 2019 and in the Getty Images collection. So really important to note that lots of the visuals that we see about any kind of issue in the media, but on climate change as well, come from these major image collection agencies. So if you want to make change, this is what our group is keen to do, you need to work with these organisations who actually have been really receptive to these conversations, which is great. So in the sort of 2000s, these are common sort of images that we see on climate protests. People dressed up, so you can't see their faces, lots of people, and very consistent with what we call the protest paradigm. So protesters are pictured as deviant, socially deviant, you know, different, othered. There's lots of people, the police are in charge, it might be violent, and so on. So that's what climate protest looks like. You know, there's big panned out shots, people from a distance, no faces. As we move on into more current times, though, we get very different types of climate images. I mean, there is a difference of one of black and white and one of colour, but that's just a question of data collection, as I mentioned earlier, the difficulty of that, and those earlier ones from microfilms from the British Library. So looking at digital newspapers in 2019 and the Getty Images collection, we see totally different types of pictures. Children become pictured, and they're powerful actors. Look at their eye contact in those pictures. And this is really typical of all the images that Sylvia found in that later data set. The camera angle suggests agency, children given power, you know, and Sylvia's done a bunch of interviews with photojournalists, and they're talking about how they, because obviously a photojournalist is generally a man, or sometimes a woman, but, you know, it's an adult, and they're getting down on their knees so they can photograph up into the faces of those children to give them agency. So they're not portrayed as victims. And there's really, we argue that there's got this framing of intergenerational justice, and it's a real change from what we've seen earlier. And yeah, as I know, many of those images are attributed to image collections. So those global agencies like Getty, AP, Associated Press, Shutterstock, and so on. And yeah, I think it's just interesting to see that change. Even somebody said to Sylvia, well, isn't that just the Greta effect? And indeed, that's what we call the paper, the Greta effect. Isn't it just because all of them, or many of them, picture Greta? So she took the Greta images out, and she still found that stood without Greta herself in there. So it's like the Greta effect has kind of rippled across climate protest imagery. And there's photojournalists and news editors, when they're looking to put these images out, are looking for those pictures of powerful children, particularly women and girls, to visualise climate protest. Okay, and finally, a last case study, drawing on some work from the last summer. Now, I know presenting this in Australia seems a bit ridiculous when we're talking about heat waves, but we did in the UK, unfortunately, have our first 40-degree heat day last summer, which was obviously a real shock. A lot of people thought that we wouldn't get there for a decade or more, and yet we had over 40 degrees in several places in the UK. So we had, you know, heat waves are a risk issue, and if anyone is an epidemiologist or works on health, you'll know that there's what we call a U-shaped curve with heat waves. So you get you get lots of deaths when it's very cold, and you get lots of deaths when it's very hot, and then there's a kind of minimum point, a kind of, you know, a sweet point where human health is optimized, if you like, but that point changes, like the bottom of that U changes depending on where you are in the world. So in Australia, that U shape will be shifted up to a warm, in Melbourne or Brisbane or whatever, shifted further up. So as in, like, the bottom of that U will be warmer than it is in the UK. So although we can kind of joke around and say, oh, how is 30 degrees a heat wave? Heat waves are socially mediated, right? It depends on whether you've got access to AC, or whether you how you travel to work, whether you work outside a lot, what kind of clothes you wear, what kind of clothes is it culturally acceptable to wear, you know, whether you have a culture of carrying water around, you know, lots of different reasons, many of which are quite complex about how we deal with living with heat, which means that heat waves mean different things in different places. But anyway, the visuals around heat waves, we'd kind of noticed for a long time, and it's not a new observation, that often when we had heat waves, we got all these pictures of people having a fun time at the beach. And we thought, like, is this actually a thing, or is this just us because we work on climate change and we're kind of, you know, you see what you think you see? Let's study it and find out. So working with James Painter and a whole bunch of other great researchers from across Europe, we did a 4-country study. So we looked at new heatwave news in the UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And the real driving force for this is because we know that visuals play a key role in how we think about climate change. And this is a real key part of climate change adaptation. We're going to get more heat waves. It's definitely going to happen. They're going to get hotter, they're going to get longer, the duration is going to increase, and they're going to become more intense. So we need to adapt to them. We need to change how society deals with heat waves. And if we always think that they're having a fun time at the beach, then that might impact how or how not we deal with the risk of increasing heat. So we looked over a summer in those 4 countries at any visual that was attached to news about climate change and heat waves. And what we found is that the visuals were almost always positively valenced, or were very commonly positively valenced. That means, in psychological terms, that it made people feel like it was a positive thing, something, heat waves were there to be enjoyed, something to look forward to, high days and holidays. Conversely, we looked at the text that went alongside those media articles, and only 1 or 2 of them out of the entire data set were positively valenced. So almost many of them were negatively valenced, talked about the risks of heat waves, talked about deaths, talked about how to deal with heat risk, and so on. But they didn't say heat waves were a fun thing, that you should go to the beach and have a fun time and have an ice cream. So there's a real dissonance, right, between the text, what the text is saying, and what the images are saying. They're pulling in different narrative directions. Something that DeFrancesco and Young found in a paper in 2012 and in Canada is really evident here on this heatwave news. And this is really important because if we're hoping people will read news about heatwaves and make kind of decisions that protect their health and the health of their family and friends and their colleagues and co-workers, then what, how are they going to interpret those very different types of information? And we found two common visual frames. The first one was this fun in the sun imagery. So yeah, people going to the beach, having a fun time, playing in on the side water, lots of people, groups of friends, very, very common, particularly in the UK, but also in those other countries. And the second visual frame, which was not something we were necessarily expecting to find, was this visual frame called that we called the idea of heat. So interestingly, this did connote the idea of heat as danger. So heat, very hot sunbursts, like whited out, high saturation images, thermometers showing high temperatures, sometimes kind of like orangey type pics with people sipping a drink, but they were silhouetted against the sun. What was really interesting about those pictures is that they were hardly ever had people in. And when they did have people in, the people were silhouetted or sort of blacked out, so you couldn't see their faces. They weren't acting in groups, they were only alone. And there was no kind of connection between the viewer and the people that were represented. So our argument from this paper is that there's two main concerns around the kind of current visual discourse on heatwaves in these countries. The first is that it's displacing concerns of vulnerability. So it's really marginalising the experience of people who are vulnerable to heatwaves. We know young children, elderly people, well, people over 75, people with pre-existing health conditions, and people in poor quality housing are all at much higher risk of heatwaves than others, but they're not there. We don't see them, and they're not part of the story. So therefore, they're kind of completely excluded from thinking about what heatwaves mean to us as we think more about climate change into the future. And secondly, these images are really excluding opportunities for imagining a more resilient future. One thing we found that was really interesting is one organisation, sorry if you're Dutch, Algemeen Dagblad, which is a newspaper in the Netherlands, which did do things differently. So they were only a very small part of our sample, but they had some images that showed people in a care home, elderly people eating a lolly, an icy pole, is that right? Is that correct? Yeah, translation, eating an ice lolly, right? Or they had people, a young family sitting in front of a fan looking visibly uncomfortable, or they showed people an urban heat island image where they had like a kind of sliding scale, going from a grey kind of horrible looking urban area like boulevard that was empty and obviously kind of very hot and uninviting, that had been greened by the local council and was full of trees and people playing, and it looked really nice, shady kind of, and we know that those are really important for reducing the urban heat island effect. So it's not, self-evident that we should use these sorts of images, the majority of images, for representing heat waves. There are other ways to visualize heat waves. So this is a part of our ongoing work that we're hoping to get some funding for. We're applying for a grant at the moment to work with news agencies and these big commercial image agencies to really try and reshape the visual discourse of heat waves. And one of the last things, the last slide here is just to say that we've also, a really interesting thing that I've been doing increasingly through my fellowship is working with others in my group in computer science and into the computer science department, not only looking, because I'm a qualitative researcher primarily, looking at kind of individual images or, up to data sets of maybe 200-300 data images, maybe 1,000 max. That's what I think is really big. Then I chat to my computer science colleagues and they're like, Saf, we need 40,000 images. Oh my gosh, this is a whole different kettle of fish. So, but we're doing really interesting work now using both computer vision. So using, like if you use Google image search, it's looking at the pixels. It's not looking at what your kind of search terms. It's comparing different kind of pixel shapes or pixel kind of combinations, if you like, to look for similar types of images. So we're using both computer vision approaches and qualitative approaches to look more generally. And one of the reasons we're really interested in this is because we'd like to look globally, and it's very hard to do this, obviously, this kind of small scale stuff in big multinational studies. And because we know from looking over the Indian subcontinent heat wave that we had sort of early to mid last year, that heat waves are visualized really differently throughout the world. So in India and Pakistan, we saw many images that showed how people were struggling with the impacts of extreme heat. So it's not self-evident that you need to use people having fun in the sun. So there's a lot of learning that we think could be done from the global north to the global north from the global south on this. So just a heads up to my colleagues Travis Cohen and our PhD student Rani Malla on that.